Okay, I have it as 12:30. Also, can I do a little mic test? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danny Sharella. I'm an outreach archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina. Today, I am joined by the team behind Connecting the Docs, which is our podcast. And we're going to talk about how we use archival collections to tell stories related to North Carolina's history. But before old historians John Horan and Annabeth Poe get us started, I will say that if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll be sure that we get to them during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to John and Annabeth.
All right, great. Thank you, Danny. I am John Horan, and I am the oral historian at the State Archives of North Carolina. And there I work with members of the public to get their voices into the official record of the state, using their voices with their stories. And that's my day job. But I also work as the host for the podcast we'll be talking about today.
Yes, and I'm Annabeth Poe, the Assistant Oral Historian at the State Archives. I also work firsthand with the oral history collections, but the podcast is actually what brought me to the archives, first as an intern last summer, and now as an official member of the podcasting team and occasional host.
That's exactly right. So let's start with a little bit about the podcast. Connecting the Docs is True Stories from the Old North State began in 2019 as a digital podcasting project. The first season consisted of 9 episodes, approximately 30 minutes each. Each episode focused on true and infamous crime stories from across the state, centered on murder, mystery, and mayhem. Details were drawn from the archive's records, which in turn inspired discussions between the season's host, archive staff, and special guests about how archival records can help tell important stories from the past. While the podcast had an initial success, production stopped in 2020 due to staff turnover and, more importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in 2021, the show returned with a new group of producers from all parts of the archives, and while it kept the same general format and goal to use archival sources to tell North Carolina stories, each subsequent season has had a new focus, painting a broader picture of North Carolina's past beyond true crime and explaining history's relevance today.
Connecting the Docs' production follows a general order of operations that reflects broader podcasting standards. So these are picking a topic, doing research, scripting the episodes, recording the audio, and publishing and publicizing the show. We aren't going to go through each and every step in detail, so we can take a note from the podcast and get into individual stories, but we did want to quickly walk through the range of topics that we've explored on the podcast.
While each episode needs a topic, we first take a look at the big picture. We start with the thematic ideas for the whole season. For example, in Season 1, we decided to discuss stories of murder, mystery, and mayhem, as I've said. In Season 2, the podcast team decided to explore unprocessed stories, which we defined broadly. We added stories of new collections waiting to be processed, and stories of historical moments that had processed collections for, but the event itself remained unprocessed in popular culture. In Season 3, 4, and 5, however, we decided to break it down further and do mini-series. Throughout, though, we generally try to showcase the work of interns and highlighting their work with the collections, like creating a finding aid for underrepresented communities in the General Assembly,
which would be the manumission episode from last season,
or providing interviews with notable North Carolinian historians,
including an interview with David Sosowski and this season, Dr. Claude Clegg.
We also have episodes and information answering questions about the archive and what we do behind the scenes.
For example, we have the Ask an Archivist episode. And throughout this, we always attempt to share stories that reflect larger historical questions, societal concerns, and even departmental initiatives. For example, in Season 3, we explored true stories from the Outer Banks as a response to the popularity of the book and film Where the Crawdads Sing. In Season 4, we wanted to support the departmental and indeed statewide Year of the Trail initiative with a 3-part series meant to showcase the history of the trails and highlight just how easy it is to get out there and take a hike. The other mini-series we worked on for Season 4 is the Uncovered Story series. You'll be hearing from Josh in a second about another one of the episodes, but I want to take a minute to highlight one that I worked on as an intern at the State Archives last summer before I started working here. It's called The Revolutionary Ruthie Jackson Letter. The episode centers on a letter written by Ruthie Jackson, a woman living in Hillsborough in 1781. Years prior, she had given birth to a daughter named Nancy, who was the product of Jackson's affair with General Francis Nash. Nash, the namesake of Nash County, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee, and North Carolina, was a Revolutionary War hero, even leading men into battle alongside George Washington. However, by 1781, Nash had died in battle, leaving Nancy without a father. Further, as Ruthie Jackson's health failed, she knew her daughter would be left orphaned. This led her to write a letter to a judge in eastern North Carolina named John Williams, who was Francis Nash's longtime friend, and she asked him to adopt Nancy after she died. I wanted to pull this example because determining topic ideas is not very different from when a researcher comes in and explores collections. For example, Caitlin Martell, a former member of the Digital Access Branch, found the Ruthie Jackson letter by chance when she was digitizing the John Williams military collection here at the archives. She wasn't expecting to find it, which mirrors the experience of people who discover records and work with our materials in the search room. It then inspired her to set out to find exactly what happened to Ruthie Jackson, and in the process, it provided the narrative backbone to one of our most listened to episodes. In the episode, Caitlin and I walked through how we researched the letter and attempted to determine what happened to Ruthie Jackson and Nancy, highlighting their stories after decades in the shade of the Nash family legacy, as well as highlighting archival records in the process. Personally, I explored so many different collections within the archives that in many ways trace the untraceable. These are collections of legal bonds, specifically bastardy bonds, guardian bonds, and apprentice bonds, which feature information about children on the edge of social bounds that may not be mentioned by name in any other contemporaneous records, such as censuses, tax documents, etc. The search for Ruthie Jackson and Nancy also led me to one of North Carolina's most unique collections, a series of British government financial records available through microfilm dating back to the 1500s. While we found some surprises, which you'll have to listen to the podcast to hear about, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Caitlin and I did struggle to concretely answer the question of what happened to Ruthie Jackson and Nancy, but we could answer questions about how to do archival research. Using historical context, we explained where we looked and why to help demystify the historical research process and archival work.
In season 5, America's 250th birthday begins to take center stage with stories of the precursors to the American Revolution in North Carolina. This series includes an episode about the regulator movement in the Piedmont, a collaboration with Alamance Battleground Historical Site, and an episode about the daily life of average North Carolinians during the war itself. We're also exploring the A250 theme of When Are We Us, with a series on schools in North Carolina. And that part is in part available now, so please go ahead, like, rate, subscribe, listen to the whole thing as it comes out. But these episodes on schools, we focus on African American and American Indian students under segregation and after, with a particular focus on busing. So these examples scratch the surface of how each episode and season align with the podcast's overall goal of welcoming people into the archives by telling stories and explaining archival procedures in a highly accessible way.
So after we pick a topic, that's where we bring in step 2, which is research. The beauty of the podcast is that we take an inventory of the archives collections and in what formats and help pare down what can be used in each episode to tell stories in an accurate, engaging way. So the research process. This also creates a unique opportunity to put records from different collections in conversations with each other. Scripting then creates the space to, pardon the pun, connect the dots we found through research in our collections. Recording lends voices to the conversation, and editing helps us check for accuracy and consistency. We also add commercials, which help us advertise new archives initiatives, programs, as well as events as they happen. Then we publish and publicize the podcast. Connecting the Dots is published through Podbean, which distributes it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and RSS feeds. Yes, this is the third or fourth time you'll hear like and subscribe at all of those points. Episodes are also featured on the Archives blog called History for All the People. The blog automatically posts to social media and provides a link to the episode as well as episode notes that attribute sources and briefly describe the episode's content.
So Now you know a little bit about the podcast, but why create a podcast in the first place? Well, like we said, Connecting the Docs represents an attempt to increase access to the state archives by using podcasting to teach people about state history. And at the same time, the episodes demystify both the historical research process and archival work to invite listeners to explore the record collections for themselves. Connecting the Docs is uniquely situated to bridge the gap between institutions and the public by interpreting records and research through the human voice. It allows both the archives as an institution and the records to speak in an accessible way. The hosts and the episode guests have a unique position of authority, but can also maintain both authenticity and transparency because of the nature of podcasting as a digital medium. It prioritizes people. This increases the podcast's overall impact as it seeks to excite people about history through historical storytelling and explaining historical research. The work of the podcast is to expand access while also providing tools that invite individuals to come in and do their own research regardless of their projects. We maintain Connecting the Docs as an effort in combining traditional storytelling methods with accessibility through digital media, therefore democratizing history and the archives in a neat, little, digestible recording. And we are seeing results. On the screen here, you can see some of our statistics. We've released 43 episodes to date, with 9 more on the way as part of season 5. We've had actually more than what's on the screen. I checked this morning again, and it is up 100 downloads from what's there. So we've had 9,412 downloads since 2009, with approximately 3,000 downloads just this fiscal year. Our most popular episodes to date include Season 1 True Crime Tales, an episode on Appalachian music, the Uncovered Stories series, and of course, the Year of the Trail series. We've also heard from staff in the search room that there have been several research requests related to content covered on the podcast, as well as a recent tour group featuring a super fan. So that's our overview at this point, and we'll pass it over to Josh to start our episode highlights.
Thank you, John and Annabeth. I am Josh Hager, and when I'm not participating in the podcast, I have the fortune of being the head of our government records description unit, which means that my staff and I are the folks that work on the back end of the records to get them ready for people like you to use them in the search room. Mike is on my team, so you'll hear from Mike and I a little bit about some of the things that we see when we're doing records. And that totally leads to this spotlight, because our first spotlight is our episode that we did in the Uncovered Stories series about enslaved persons in the Treasurers and Comptrollers papers. I first joined the podcast, by the way, in season 2 with an episode on spooky stories. So I would encourage you to check that one out. It's still one of my favorites. You can hear about a werewolf that may have lived in North Carolina back in 1799. But in this series, we're a bit more straightforward. No werewolves here. So how this whole project started, and next slide, Danny, is, as a lot of other projects start, with not the podcast in mind, but just the larger goals of the archives. And in fact, the podcast does have a pretty strong track record of showing those behind the scenes projects. As John and Annabeth intimated, we try very hard to not just highlight the records themselves, but to also give you a look behind the curtain or behind the stacks door if you've been in the search room, to sort of see what we do on a day-to-day basis. And also for the fact that you only probably work directly with the folks in public services, or maybe with folks if you're a donor, with folks in special collections. We have a staff of nearly 70 people who are working every day in the archives. And what is it that we do? So some of our episodes that really focus in on this front, we've covered a 3-part miniseries on the life cycle of a record that takes the journey of a piece of paper from, let's say, the Department of Public Instruction through all the steps that it takes until it ends up in front of you in the search room. And we had staff on from all different units for that series. The hidden narrative stories, of course. And the image you're seeing is from our series on disaster preparedness, we had 2 episodes looking at the stories of storms in North Carolina that my co-producer Katie Crickmore did a great job putting together. But we had a 3rd episode looking at what we as the archives can do to help agencies prepare for disasters. And as part of that episode, we actually included this image in the show notes, and we had John go through and try to pick out all the different things that could be wrong here. Sorry, it wasn't John. It was the other producers. John wasn't there that day. It was Katie. Thank you. It was Katie trying to pick out all the things wrong with this image. And what, for example, you see there's a water stain in the ceiling that could indicate there could be a leak that might come down on those boxes that are on the ground. So we went through those steps. And as you can imagine, our part of the unit, our records and analysts that respond to disasters are quite busy right now. And Kayla Leonard, who's our disaster preparedness archivist based in New Bern, is gathering information as we speak on responses to Western North Carolina. So it's a little bit behind the curtain as to what we do on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. Hidden narratives is a good window into something that we had been doing in our unit and records description unit for the past several years, working with T&C. The Treasurers and Comptrollers papers is a large collection and one of our oldest. It is records, as you might imagine, from the state treasurer's office, as well as the state comptroller, which had similar functions to what would eventually become the state auditor's office. The papers were intermingled before they came to us, and they came to us in the early 20th century. We had to go ahead and reprocess the entirety of the collection because they were stored in the boxes that you see here, 517 of them, and they had preservation concerns and could potentially down the road cause damage to records if they weren't replaced. So we replaced all of them. In so doing, we also decided to edit the finding aid because it had been done in the 1960s, and things have changed a little bit since then. Scholarship has been updated, language has been updated. So we updated the catalog, we updated the finding aid. This was a lot of work for several folks in my unit, particularly state agency archivist Alexandra Dowry, and now current digital description archivist Caroline Waller under my supervision. It was a huge, huge project. But one of the things that they found in doing this project was something that we didn't necessarily expect. Next slide, please. We knew that there was some documentation of enslaved labor in the Treasurers and Comptrollers papers, or T&C as I'll call them from here forth. But we didn't know how much. It turned out that enslaved labor is found throughout the records in the T&C papers, documenting just how essential enslaved labor was to the early economy of North Carolina. We found it in series where we expected it, like state capitol buildings, which I'll show in just a second, but also in series like land, estates, boundaries, and surveys, where we have lists of enslaved persons like you see on the screen here. If you can see on that first column on the left, there's a list of names, and those names are enslaved persons who are listed as part of an estate. In fact, it's a return of African Americans to a person who they had been confiscated from during the Civil War. So that's this document, and it's part of this lands, estates, boundaries, and surveys. We also found enslaved persons shown on confiscated land records because they were confiscated as part of war efforts. We found enslaved persons in other miscellaneous series, including in trial transcripts. But the biggest one was in the capital projects. Next slide, please. And in ports, by the way. I should mention ports, which is also digitized. State capitol is where we expected to find some because the state capitol folks had been doing some research and it knew there was enslaved labor, but the amount was just beyond what anything we could have expected. And what we could glean from it was also more than what we expected. Here's a receipt, for example, for Peter the Carpenter, an enslaved person whose labor helped build the Capitol building. Peter the Carpenter is a very interesting case because you might assume enslaved labor in this time period was just doing menial work, but a carpenter work was very skilled, very highly trained, and Peter had been hired out. That is to say, his slave, the person who owned him, his enslaver, had essentially given Peter over to the capital project and then took the benefits, the money paid out in this receipt, $19.45, went to his enslaver, not to Peter the carpenter. So it really enlightens both the experience of enslaved persons and what enslaved labor actually looked like and how much more complicated it was than you might think at a surface level. Next slide. So we decided that this was going to be an episode of the podcast because of its importance and how this reprocessing project, which we had to do anyway, shone a light on this huge swath of enslaved persons and other underrepresented communities. So we crafted the narrative with Annabeth's help, with Alex and Caroline. We went to record the episode, and I will say the narrative that we crafted, if you listen to the show, we start with behind the scenes context of how the project was created and what we did. Then we went to historical context of what's going on in general in the economy of early North Carolina. And then we provided specific stories like Peter the Carpenter's. Caroline and Alex get into details from ports and confiscated lands in the episode. And I encourage you to check it out. At this stage, after the podcast, we are almost done with a LibGuide that an intern created that highlights every enslaved person's name in specific series in Treasures and Comptrollers that will be ready and published on our website as soon as, hopefully in the next few months, or if not sooner. And if you have any questions on this particular project, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to answer any questions about this series. But I do appreciate the fact that our podcast allows us to highlight these uncovered narratives. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague in public services, Katie Crickmore.
Hello. My name is Katie Crickmore, as was said. I am a reference archivist at the State Archives. I joined the podcast team for the 4th season officially, but I made a guest appearance on the 3rd season for the 4th episode called Murder, Mystery, and Mayhem Revisited, the true stories behind North Carolina murder ballads. The episode goes into detail about 5 classic murder ballads with North Carolina true crime roots, comparing the story told in the song to the real events based on our records here at the State Archives. You can hear all about what we discovered in the episode, but today I'll be discussing the research behind the scenes and the preparation done for the episode. So first off, let's define a murder ballad is a subgenre of traditional folk ballads that tells the story of a murder or a suspicious death. The genre was popularized by folk songs based on true crime stories, which were largely recorded in the US between the 1920s and 1960s. But the genre can also include more modern examples of fictionalized crime, like Goodbye Earl by the Chicks, Nobody No Crime by Taylor Swift, and Stand by Eminem. We chose this topic for a few reasons. Generally speaking, we wanted something somewhat spooky for the Halloween release date for the season 3 episode. And the podcast had begun with dissecting a few true crime cases. So this episode was framed as a revisitation of that topic. And then additionally, the murder ballad tradition is often compared to today's true crime interest. So there was a pop culture angle there. I have a quote up on the screen here from an article called The Murder Ballad Was the Original True Crime Podcast. It states, the sensationalism established in the murder ballad traces a direct line to the true crime boom of today. It stayed a storytelling constant in American society, from penny dreadfuls to urban legends to Lifetime original movies. And then lastly, murder ballads were abundant in Appalachian folk music, and a surprising number of well-known murder ballads were based on North Carolina true crime cases from the 1800s and early 1900s. So we had a big pool of primary resources to draw from, especially from our county court records. So in choosing what cases and what murder ballads to focus on, I began with a lot of secondary research, focusing on the history of murder ballads, how the tradition evolved in the South, and I started a list of possible North Carolina options to cover in our episode. Eventually, I settled on 5 ballads to cover: Oh Me Wise, the Ballad of Frankie Silver, Tom Dooley, Poor Ellen Smith, and the Lawson family murder. Those 5 were chosen based on parameters like popularity of song, availability of records, and the differences in the cases themselves. For example, 3 of the 5 followed the common structure of old school murder ballads, where a woman was murdered by her lover, but the other 2 broke from this pattern. All were also in the right time frame that I would expect to find good primary sources here at the State Archives. And in terms of popularity, 2 of the 5 were more obscure examples, while the other 3 were more well-known, with Tom Dooley being the obvious best example. With 5 cases, the research could get complicated, so I decided to organize all my notes into a bunch of different spreadsheets, and I created a write-up of each case. These made it easier to track all the timelines involved, the citations, and to compare elements of the murder ballads to the real story. For example, in the case of Tom Dooley, the crime and subsequent trials took place over several years, involved at least 3 different counties, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court twice, so we had tons of material to go through. So briefly about Tom Dooley, the story goes in May of 1866, Laura Foster of Caldwell County goes missing while riding into Wilkes County to meet with Tom Dooley, her on-again, off-again lover. Months later, her body is discovered in a shallow grave in between the planned meeting place and Dooley's house. Dooley was immediately suspected, along with Laura's cousin, Ann Melton, who also had a romantic history with Tom. The 2 were tried separately, and while Ann was acquitted, Dooley was convicted of the murder and condemned to death, and he was hanged in 1868 while still professing his innocence. This case was big news at the time. So there were witness statements, court transcripts, and even a hand-drawn map showing notable locations related to the case that you can see up on the screen here. And the abundance of these records were a real boon when comparing the details of the case to the murder ballad itself. So in the murder ballad, I chose to focus on the most popular version of the song, which was the 1958 recording by the Kingston Trio, which is often credited as starting the folk revival of the mid-1900s in the US. And this version is actually pretty sparse on the actual case details, so it was very easy to do a line-by-line fact check. So as you can see here on the screen, it's mostly true, according to the lines in the song. It wasn't that easy for all of the cases we looked at, unfortunately, like for Omi Wise. Omi Wise was a personal favorite of mine and is often credited as one of the oldest murder ballads originating in the US, so I was excited to dig into these original records, but had several letdowns during my research. The case details are as follows. Sometime in the spring of 1807, the body of Naomi Wise was found floating in the Deep River in Randolph County. Immediately, John Lewis of the same county is arrested for her murder, although he claims he was innocent. According to contemporary sources that inspired the murder ballad, Lewis was rumored to be in a relationship with Wise, who may have recently become pregnant by him. However, it seems that Lewis may have actually been acquitted of Naomi's murder. Although the court records are very bare-boned, it was clear that Lewis fled the county right after his arrest and wasn't recaptured for several years. And by the time he was brought back to the county, it was almost as if the murder case was forgotten in the court records. He was tried for escaping jail for the first time in 1807, but there was no record for him being tried for Omi Wise's murder. I did find a reference in the Randolph County Court of Pleas and Quarter Sessions 1815 book where he may have been tried for her murder in Guilford County instead of Randolph. And if that was the case, he would have then been acquitted of the murder. However, the Guilford County Courthouse suffered a fire that destroyed much of their court records, so we can't know for sure if this was the same case that he was being tried for. Because of the lack of records in this case, it was nearly impossible to verify any specific details from the murder ballad, even though it was packed full of detail, like where the couple's meeting spot was, and it went into the motive for the murder. But even though the lack of records was disappointing in this case, it did not hurt the podcast episode. In the episode, we were able to highlight some really interesting documents from our collections, and we were able to discuss not just the cases themselves, but the history of North Carolina folk music and the nature of true crime as a source of entertainment. I really loved researching these cases, and I would definitely recommend you give the episode a listen for more details about the true stories behind Tom Dooley, Omi Wise, and the 3 other North Carolina murder ballads we covered. and then I will pass it over to my colleague, Mike Childs.
Hi there. I'm Mike Childs. I'm a archivist with the Records Description Unit. I work under Josh Hager. And I just like to say that all the records and photos you're going to see here are from our collections here at the State Archives. So I had the pleasure of relating this odd tale in the podcast, one of the podcasts. And this is how it all started, is this very odd photo. This is our former governor, Bob Scott, in the lower left there. He was our governor from 1969 to 1973. And here he is posing with a possum for some reason that we'll gradually get into here. And that's next slide. So fortunately, on the back of the photo, we see that it's been annotated. Thank you very much, annotator. We have Governor Scott. We have Tom Ellis, who's the gentleman in the North Carolina Wildlife Protection Division uniform, a fellow named Larry Barnes, and possum named Slow Poke, that was his name, and Miss Possum, Margaret Ann Wilkes, the lovely lady posing in the photo. So this was a very intriguing photo to me. I didn't even know we had a Miss Possum. And so I was very intrigued. So I delved into to find out the story of this. And this is an official photo, as you can see down here on the stamp. There's the Department of Conservation and Development publicity photo. So next slide. So there's another official photo of Slow Poke. This is a little possum who got into big trouble. Next slide. Okay, so it all starts at the Spivey's Corner National Hollering Contest, which made the national news. And hollering, if you don't know, is basically it's a way that country folk communicated over long distances before the telephone. They basically just had to yell at each other. It's kind of like hog calling in a way. So at the contest, next slide. They didn't just do hollering, they also did the prettiest possum contest, which Slowpoke was our winner here. And this photo is from the News and Observer negative collection. The Raleigh News and Observer donated their entire photo collection to us a few years back. I was very happy to be part of the crew that got to go and pack all that up and bring it on over. And it's a fantastic collection. It's huge. So many local and state events are recorded there. So many people and places. It's fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough. Next slide. And of course, we have all the North Carolina governor's papers here. And this is some of Governor Scott's official papers. And as governor, he really enjoyed issuing proclamations for many things. Daily, he was issuing proclamations. So in honor of the hollering contest, as you can see on the left here, he proclaimed Hollerin' Day in North Carolina on June 20th. And the same day, he also declared Possum Pickin' Day, of all things. You might be curious what possum picking is. Well, unfortunately, it's like a pig picking, like a barbecue. Next slide. Dun, dun, dun. Bad news for our pal Slowpoke here. So as winning possum of the contest, he was to go to the governor to have dinner. I'm sorry, be dinner. Next slide. And so here he is being presented to the governor by our own Agriculture Secretary Jim Graham there, holding up the possum by his tail. And this is again all from the Governor Scott's scrapbooks. While he was governor, he subscribed to a lot of celebrities and politicians and big organizations did this. They would subscribe to what was called a clipping service. And they would clip out all the newspaper articles about you and save them for you. So Governor Scott had one of those. And here we can see from his scrapbook, he was not shy about this story. He was happy to have it known that he planned to eat this possum. Excuse me. So the press had a field day with the story. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. This is the official verdict on poor Mr. Slow Poke, I'm not going to tell you what document this is because it would spoil the story. But this is an official state document, and he was sentenced to death and devourment, which until I stumbled on this story, I didn't know devourment was a word. I didn't know that was a thing. I think maybe Scott invented that word. Next slide. All right, yeah, so the press had a field day, and this was another article from his clippings in his scrapbook, and press had a lot of fun with this. And here, and then tragically, you can see that Scott lost that critical possum vote. All right, next slide. And so that's the end of my tale for now. If you would like to learn more, you can obviously please listen to the podcast and subscribe and hit that like button. You can also read about this in the NCpedia, which is a wonderful website that our state library next to us runs. It's a wonderful resource of the North Carolina Government and Heritage Library. I got to work for that. That's how I came across this story and got to write about it. But I would not be able to tell this story without all the collections and resources available to me here at our state archives. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that story. And thank you to all of our presenters today. If you would like to listen to Connecting the Docs on your own, you can either scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, or you can just search Connecting the Docs wherever you get your podcasts. I find mine on Spotify very easily. So now I'm going to stop screen sharing and field some questions for the panel. Yes, the slides will be available later, and also everyone that's attending is going to get a link to the recording of this presentation to share as you see fit. Let's see. What should my first step be when starting my research?
I can jump in with this one a little bit. So I would say the first thing you should do is determine exactly what questions you want answered. So kind of what is your end goal? For example, if you're doing general genealogy research, it would be kind of overwhelming to say, oh, I know my ancestor lived in the 1800s in this county. Where do I go from there? Instead, say, I want to know if my ancestor got married in this county in, around this time. That's a lot easier to focus on. So yeah, first step I would say is decide exactly what questions you want answered and then go from there.
How long does it take from picking a topic to the published podcast?
Yeah, so I'll take this one if that's okay. John, you can chime in too. So it really depends on the episode. Sometimes some episodes are quicker than others. For example, the Ask an Archivist episode, that's a pretty straightforward one. We post online asking people to send us questions. They send us questions and we just go around and ask archivists the questions and record it. And then stitch it together and publish it. But then and another one we have coming up that's kind of like that is Mystery Box, where Josh pulled a box. This is a little teaser. Josh pulled a box and didn't tell us what it was about. And so we all got to sit down and go through the box and kind of just figure it out. So that was a very quick recording, low research on our end other than Josh's initial research. And then that one is ready to go. And it really emulates the research process, that one, for example. But then other ones are much longer. So Ruthie Jackson, which I talked about earlier, it took a long time. I want to say it was about a month because we knew kind of where we wanted to look, but we didn't know exactly what we would find. And then, of course, we found stuff and then we didn't find stuff, and that took us down different avenues. So it, again, just really depends on the episode. The Year of the Trail one is another one that took a while because the documents for that one is a unprocessed collection, which is like a massive box that hadn't been gone through yet. And so that one took a while to kind of comb through and see what happens. But as I said, it does really emulate the real research process from start to finish. And it all depends on topic, records, and sometimes it just depends on luck, what you find and what you know is out there, and what you don't know is out there, and then you stumble upon and you create a whole episode around it. So it's kind of a cool process. But the research is what takes the longest in the scripting, and then processing, recording, all that on the back end is a little bit quicker of a timeline.
Gotcha. And this one's probably best for Josh, but anyone can chime in. Are there any upcoming or ongoing digitizing projects happening at the archives? The online collections are extremely useful, hoping to see more come online.
I'm sure that there are. I don't have any direct work in the digital access branch. That's a different part of our archives, a dedicated team. They've had some staff turnover recently, so there might be some collections coming out at a slightly slower clip than usual, but I rest assured that more collections are always coming. I don't know exactly what those collections are, but there are definitely more to come. I encourage you to reach out to our head of digital services, Ashley Yandel, if you have any questions on that. And you can always send an email just to our standard email box, which is archives@dncr.nc.gov, and they can route your email to the right person. And I'm sure that Ashley can fill you in on what's coming in the digitization queue. But I'm glad you're finding the collection useful. That's fantastic.
And I'll just jump in right there and say that we just published a whole bunch of our oral histories online. They were already digital, so it's not a digitization piece, but they are now available for you to listen to just at the comfort of your own home through the digital collection. So have at it.
And Josh, we have a comment. I'm interested in discussing the TNC docs further with Joshua. How can I reach you? So would you mind just putting your email in the chat?
I'll be happy to do so.
Perfect. So next question, how do you resolve or proceed when you reach a point where you cannot find your answer? How do you redirect your research?
So I can jump in again on that. So I had mentioned earlier, the first step would probably be in, starting your research, deciding what questions you want answered. I can give kind of an example based on the Murder Ballads podcast that I researched. And this is kind of a more specific one. So after the questions are established, really secondary resources are your friend. I definitely did a lot of research to see what questions had already been answered before I dug deep into the original records. But I had two specific questions that popped, or I'll just say one for now. One specific question that popped up when researching Omi Wise's story. So I go more into this in the episode itself, but there are essentially two different versions of the Omi Wise story floating around. One was a poem that was published or it was a newspaper article actually published in the 1850s by a man from the area that told, it was kind of a narrative of the story. It was definitely fictionalized in some elements, but the murder ballad directly came from that original kind of newspaper posting. But there was also a poem that was discovered by a woman named Mary Woody that was written much sooner than the newspaper entry, and that told a different story of the incident. And that brought up a couple more questions. So in Mary Woody's poem, she said Omi Wise had actually two children before she engaged with John Lewis. And she named them, actually. One of the children's name was Nancy, and then I actually can't remember the other child. But they had specific ages, and they had names listed. The poem said they were born in Randolph County. And so that was my question. I wanted to confirm whether she had children prior to the episode, or prior to the murder ballad. So my first stop was Bastardy Bonds in Randolph County. We have a collection that goes, or that kind of lists, it was kind of an early form of child support. If you had a child outside of wedlock, you could petition the county to get funds from the father instead of the county funding the child, basically. She didn't appear in there. I searched court records instead to see if any father was named, if she was even named prior to that. I spent way too much time trying to find this, and eventually there was a dead end. I could not confirm whether she had children ahead of time. So that was a big kind of roadblock in my preparation for that episode. And the rest of the research for OmiWise kind of went the same way. I kept having questions and getting nowhere with that. But instead, it brought up a new kind of discussion about the murder ballad itself. So instead of saying, can I answer these specific questions with the research available, instead I said, well, can these contemporary sources be trusted to fill in the gaps? Like what sort of, what can we actually use these as sources? And so that kind of spun it into a completely different discussion and completely different kind of direction. So I would say just go where the research kind of points you, and it doesn't have to be the end of your research. It can just be like, okay, well, what does that tell us about, how these records were kept, or, so I would say just kind of roll with it and be open to where the research takes you.
That was great. Thank you, Katie.
And I do want to chime in on that, Danny, and say that sometimes we do obviously are trying to answer questions in the episodes, but sometimes what I'll pitch are episodes that are going to focus on a particular series, and then we go and see what the series is going to tell us. So like Katie said, we're going to go what it's going to go. But for example, in our education series that just came out, we knew we wanted to cover Rosenwald schools. But we knew we wanted to do an episode on the Rosenwald schools, but really particularly, I knew I wanted to do an episode on the Rosenwald school records that show up in what's called, it's now the Division of African American Education. It was called something else in the time period. We don't want to use that name, but we knew that record group, those records are digitized. Those records are really useful, a lot of information, but I hadn't had a chance to go through and look through everything. So we had a podcast intern and I looked through the records, and we basically created the script and the narrative based on the interesting things that we found in the series that we knew we were going to look at. So we knew what series, so it wasn't going to be a roadblock, but we had to modify the narrative according to what we found. So for example, the Genes Fund, which we didn't think we were going to cover, ended up being an essential part of the narrative, which is something that was used for paying for the teaching of African-American teachers, because it went hand in hand with Rosenwald, and the records showed that they were going together so intricately. So the records helped develop that narrative. It was going to always be that series, but we didn't know where the narrative was going to go until the research was done.
Gotcha. Thank you for that addition. And then this question is probably best for John and Annabeth. What tips would you give to other archives who hope to start a podcast about their collections?
Yeah, I mean, so I was on the team when it rebooted. I was not there for the original season 1, but I was there when it rebooted. And we try to, the biggest hurdle is just saying you can do it. I mean, that's the starting point. If you think you can do it, you can do it. And if you think you can't, you can't. And that's sort of that's like a obvious, maybe even cliche way of approaching this, but it's the truth. If you have, your archives have the stories. That's clear. So just go out there and try to find the stories to create the narratives like Josh just explained, or if you have the questions like Katie just talked about, get out there and look through the stuff, come up with a script and just record it. And then the other thing to say is don't let the technical stuff scare you off. Microphones are pretty easy to come by these days. Use your phone at the very least to come up with it. That part's pretty straightforward. And then you might be concerned about editing and making sure it sounds good and doing all of that. If you're good at that, do it. And if you're not, just get it right when you record it, and maybe it takes a couple times to record it, and that's fine. So just sort of figure out where your strengths are and play to those strengths, but don't let a fear of tech or just this concern over how do we get this out there to stop you, because the stories need to be told, and we're at the archives, we are in a unique position to tell them.
And yeah, another thing with resources that I'll add to that, you saw the picture of us in the studio, which we have amazing access to use. That's a pretty recent development in letting us use the studio. The majority of the seasons so far have been recorded in our classroom or in our search room here in the archives in a normal room, like no additional soundproofing or anything, and it sounds fine. I mean, the stuff in the studio sounds a little bit crisper if you're an audiophile, but for the majority of episodes, it doesn't make a difference. We also recorded with a microphone on the trail, near the trail. We've recorded in the search room proper, doing the mystery box coming up, and they sound fine. We've also recorded over using an online platform when we had people joining us remotely and when we were still recording pretty early on in the pandemic, and they sound fine. So don't let that be, we don't have a studio, so we can't record. Don't let that be your enemy. Also, our episodes are sometimes kind of long. No, it doesn't have to be, our episodes range from anywhere from a half hour to an hour, but you may land on something different. You may want to do 10-minute chunks, one document per episode. You may want to do an entire series. So you have a collection that's, a really famous diary. Maybe you want to do little mini episodes where each episode is a different entry in the diary and trace this person's life. Think about creative ways to do it that fit with your time, your availability, your resources. But if you publish it, they will listen, to borrow from Field of Dreams. And as long as you get some numbers, and as long as you get people telling you you're listening, and as long as you get people accessing the records for questions, for research, it's doing its job.
And I'll come back in real quick to make another plug. If you are looking for microphones, we have at the archive, and you're in North Carolina, we have at the archives we have recording kits. We use them for oral histories to loan out for oral histories. But why not use them for podcasts? It's a similar kind of process. We have them in Raleigh. We have them in Charlotte, in the eastern part of the state. I think it's in New Bern, and then in the western part of the state, it's in Asheville. So just reach out to us and borrow our equipment to record and get your podcast rolling. Why not?
Took the words right out of my mouth, John.
Oh, sorry, Danny.
It's all right. Our next question is, are there any other stories of interest that you want to explore in later seasons? So I don't know if we want to give a sneak peek of the next season, but if not, I am kind of interested to see if Mike has found any other interesting stories in government records.
Oh, sure. That's one of the joys of my job, is stumbling on interesting documents and information. There's been a lot of things that I've come across. When there was a lot of interesting stuff for the 1976 bicentennial that the state did. And one of the things I stumbled on is there was a whole radio series with 13 episodes for showcasing North Carolina music. And we had the fortunate ability to get that digitized, and it is available, but it's only available here in the archives due to copyright issues. But you can get, copies for personal use to take, and you can also listen to it here. I think the biggest thing would have to be the folk life collection. So the North Carolina Arts Council has a folk life division, and they have that started in, I believe, 1977, and they have collected so much amazing things since then. This is might be the biggest media collection that we have here, because they had tons of cassette tapes of audio recordings of mostly oral histories with different North Carolina craftspeople and artists and musicians, and just ordinary people who make a living. We did a lot of coastal material on the old ways of oyster shucking and the fishing industry, and very fascinating topics. There was a number, like the radio series, there was also a number of folk life festivals and folklife festivals where they had a bunch of musical guests and recorded them. And again, we have them here, but we can't, put them online again due to copyright issues. But there are some fantastic things in there. And like I say, it had video, audio. We have some actual commercial records of folk music that they had collected. It's just an amazing, wonderful collection. I can't recommend enough if you're interested in anything related to North Carolina folkways.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Have you collaborated with other counties for a series or special episodes? And if you are interested in doing so, how would a county go about pursuing that avenue?
Well, we haven't partnered with a county specifically. We've done work with historic sites, as we've mentioned, with the Battleground, and other historic sites have reached out to us, and we've kind of worked with them. But that's at the state level, even if it is local. I would say if you are a county and you're interested in working with us, just reach out to us, and we'll get started. If you just want to work with us and you're not sure where to go, then we'll get started at that point. If you have specific stories that you want to tell and you'd be interested in seeing what kind of connections we can make at the state archives, we would love to hear about that too. So we're always looking for topic ideas, and just reach out to us and we'll figure it. Any one of us on today's panel would be the way to go. Once again, and Danny just put her email in, which would be another great place to start.
And if you ever lose my email, it's on one of the many reminder emails you got for the Zoom event. But thank you. And the last question I have here for y'all is, do you ever get topics based on researchers who ask questions in the search room? This might be a good Katie question.
Yeah, for sure. We get all sorts of ideas, actually. I work on the reference desk, so I get exposed to a lot of different research topics that patrons bring in. And it doesn't just inspire like podcast topics. I've definitely gotten inspiration for our display case in the search room. I got ideas from patron research there. Some trivia night questions have come from questions that popped up from patrons. And we also have a blog series, a few different ones that we host, and I've written a few blogs based on some interesting records that have come across the desk that patrons were looking at. So for sure, a lot of stuff gets inspired by what the public is looking at.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions. So I'll just remind everyone, if you have any other questions or you want to reach out at all, Josh and my email are in the chat. So feel free to reach out about anything and everything. And yeah, we hope you've gained the skills to start researching your own stories in the state archives, and we hope to see you in the search room.
I will say one thing, because Belle did post to finish the possum story. I'm not going to finish all of it, but I will say he survived in a most unusual way. So I will at least assuage your fears. I don't want you to be afraid or scared for Slow Poke, but how he survived, and that I have to leave for the episode because Mike describes it so well in the episode. But I did want to assuage your fears as a fellow animal lover that he was fine, but how he was fine is really the amazing part that I don't want to spoil here.
With that, we leave you with please listen. And as Annabeth Poe would say, like and subscribe. Thank you all so much.